Something's wrong with the human mind, not because of what we imagine, but because of what we refuse to believe. Every culture has stories of children found in the wilderness, of families who lived apart from society, of bloodlines that hid themselves from the world. We treat those stories like folklore, like warnings told around campfires. But sometimes folklore is simply a record of something the world wasn't ready to accept. And when those stories surface again, when the facts line up too neatly, when the evidence is undeniable, there's only one question left. How long has the truth been hiding behind our disbelief? There was a case, hidden in the Appalachian Mountains, a case that officials denied, witnesses buried, and the state erased from every archive it controlled, but fragments escaped, whispered accounts, suppressed testimonies, and a single surviving adult, who decades later finally spoke. She said that what lived in her family's blood was not meant to be known by anyone outside it. She said that some lineages do not end when the people die. They end only when the memory does. And she said that the memory was still alive. Before anyone knew her name, before the state sealed their records, before the story was rewritten as rumor, there was a barn that no one had opened in 40 years. It stood in a forgotten stretch of land where the hills fold over themselves like a clenched fist, the kind of place where roads fade into dirt and dirt fades into forest. 2 hunters found it by accident while tracking a wounded animal. But what they found instead wasn't wounded, and it wasn't an animal. It was 17 children standing silently in the dark, as though they had been waiting for someone to open the door. They ranged in age from what looked like 4 to nearly 20, but the ages didn't match the bodies. Their hair hung in tangled ropes. Their clothes were crudely stitched from fibers no one recognized. Their skin was pale enough to show the blue of veins beneath it, like something that had never stood beneath the sun. And when the hunters stepped inside, the children didn't scream, didn't retreat, didn't react at all. They simply stared with eyes too dark to reflect the light coming in through the doorway. Authorities were called. The county dispatched social workers, medical personnel, and eventually the sheriff himself. By nightfall, the barn was surrounded. Reports from that night describe a silence so complete that even the insects stopped. The air felt heavier near the barn, as though it resisted being breathed. One of the first responders later said that the children didn't feel like individuals. They felt like one thing, looking out through 17 sets of eyes. Attempts to interview them failed. They would not speak. They would not move unless the others moved. When medical staff tried to examine them, their bodies became limp and impossibly heavy, as if their weight multiplied the moment anyone tried to separate them. Their skin was cold even in the heat of June, and their eyes. Every witness mentioned the eyes. Dark, unblinking, unreactive. Pupils that did not respond to light, like the eyes of something that does not need light to see. When a social worker attempted to lead the youngest child away, the others reacted, not violently, not physically, but with sound. A tone began to rise from their throats, low, resonant, and so deep it vibrated through the walls. Witnesses described it not as hearing, but as feeling. The separated child collapsed as though her bones had liquefied. The tone stopped only when she was returned to the group. No one attempted separation again. For 72 hours, the authorities tried to determine what to do. The children could not stay where they were, but no facility was willing to take them. Eventually, they were transported together to a temporary shelter. They sat in silence the entire way, hands folded, eyes forward, breathing in the same rhythm. That night, witnesses reported hearing them singing. The language did not match any catalogued tongue. It sounded older than words. A psychiatrist was brought in, a specialist in extreme isolation and trauma. After 3 days, he submitted a report containing only one conclusion. These children were not traumatized. They were something else. What he observed during examinations was worse than silence. When one child was shown an image in private, the others later reproduced it from memory without ever having seen it. When asked their names, they all spoke the same phrase in perfect unison. "We are Dalhart." And then there was the blood. A nurse drawing a sample from one of the older boys noticed that it was darker than normal, nearly brown, and that it thickened instantly upon exposure to air. The moment the first drop entered the vial, every other child turned toward the room where the blood had been drawn. They stood, moved toward the door, and pressed their hands flat against it, waiting. They did not speak. They did not blink. They simply waited as though something had been taken from them. The sample was sent to a laboratory. It was reported lost during transport. No other sample was ever taken. By late summer, the state made a decision. The children would be separated and placed in individual facilities across 2 states. But 3 days after the separation, 2 of them were found dead in their beds. No cause, no trauma, no illness. 4 more died within the week. When the survivors were brought back together, the deaths stopped immediately. The state understood something horrifying in that moment. The children were not attached to each other. They were dependent on each other. Separation didn't distress them. It killed them. Officials panicked. Records were sealed. Decisions were made behind closed doors, and the remaining children were moved to a remote facility with no visitors, no oversight, and no public acknowledgement that they existed at all. They stayed there for 7 years. And what happened inside that building, the changes in their bodies, the failures of technology, the unexplained temperature drops, the symbols they carved, the synchronized movement even while asleep, all of it would have remained buried if one of them hadn't survived long enough to tell the truth. The state pretended to have found a solution. They chose a building far from towns, far from roads, far from questions. It had been a sanatorium decades earlier, a place where the sick were removed from the public eye. Now it was reopened quietly under a different name, staffed by people who were paid well enough not to wonder what they were caring for. The children were transported there at night, all together, because no one dared to separate them again. They walked into the building in a single line, not holding hands, not guided, but moving as though the floor itself directed their steps. From the first night, the staff noticed that time behaved strangely around them. The lights in their wing flickered, but nowhere else. Clocks ran fast, then slow. The air was colder in their rooms than in the hallways, even when the vents were sealed, and the children never spoke. They sat, moved, slept, and breathed in synchronized rhythm, as though they were pieces of a single organism spread across multiple bodies. Medical evaluations were attempted, but the results only deepened the confusion. Their growth was inconsistent. Some months, they would gain inches in height, then stop entirely for a year. Their bones showed development patterns that didn't match their apparent ages. One boy who looked 19 when they were found still looked 19 7 years later. The youngest, who should have become a teenager, still appeared to be a child. Their cells aged and did not age. Their bodies changed and did not change. They existed as though they were not bound by the human clock. Blood samples offered no clarity. The lab results returned with notes like anomalous, unstable, and incompatible with known markers. One geneticist noted that sections of their DNA resembled traits that should have disappeared thousands of years ago, echoes of something ancient. He was told not to publish. He didn't argue. He simply stopped asking questions. The staff tried to observe them at night, but when the children slept, their breathing synchronized so perfectly that it sounded like a single lung. When one shifted, they all shifted. When one dreamt, their eyelids fluttered in unison. It was like watching a hive in human form. And then there were the events no one wanted to write down. Objects moved without being touched. Doors closed quietly, even when propped open. A chair rotated to face the wall in a room no one had entered. Staff reported waking in the night to find all 11 children standing around their beds, watching. The children would return to their room without needing to be told. When questioned the next day, they did not acknowledge it. They did not need to. For 7 years, the children remained together, unchanged in their silence and impossible in their existence. But then, something shifted. The unity that held them began to loosen. Not all at once, but in small, precise ways. One boy began to sit near a window for hours, watching the tree line. One girl drew symbols, obsessively looping shapes that looked like language, but belonged to no alphabet. Another refused processed food, and would only eat vegetables grown in soil, as though her body recognized something artificial that others couldn't sense. The staff wasn't sure if this was progress or decay, but the psychiatrist who had first evaluated them had written a warning before disappearing from public life. Separation kills them, but this wasn't external separation. This was internal. The collective mind that had bound them since birth was fracturing. And the first sign of what that meant came when one of the girls, estimated to be in her 20s, though she appeared much younger, approached a nurse and asked for her name. Not the nurse's, her own. There was no answer to give. The state had never assigned names. The children were catalogued as numbers. The girl stood silently for a long moment, then walked away. That night, she spoke again. This time in English, she said, "We are forgetting." When asked what she meant, she looked at the nurse with those black, depthless eyes and said, "We are forgetting how to be Dalhart." Then she went silent again. The staff didn't understand it yet, but the children did. The weakening of the collective was not a step toward becoming human. It was the beginning of their death. Over the next months, the deterioration accelerated. The children stopped recognizing one another. They forgot their own reflections. One insisted she had died years earlier, and that the body she lived in belonged to someone else. Another became violent, not toward the staff, but toward another child, as if trying to destroy something that threatened to separate further. They were sedated and placed in different rooms. Both died within 48 hours. No illness, no trauma, just cessation, as if the body could not survive being alone. By 1980, only 4 remained alive. The state had no explanation, no plan, and no desire to be connected to whatever this was. Riverside Manor was closed. The remaining children were relocated quietly, reclassified, renamed, and released into a world that had no idea what they were. But the world was not the danger. The danger was what happened when the last remnants of a collective mind tried to live inside a single skull. The final 4 began to disappear, one by one, into the woods, into silence, into death, until there was only one left. The youngest. The last continuation of a lineage that was never born. The one who would eventually speak. The one who said the others were not gone. Just quiet. For years, the last surviving member of the group existed in silence. She moved through facilities, group homes, temporary placements, never forming attachments, never resisting, never belonging. Caseworkers described her as quiet, cooperative, and profoundly alone. She worked night shifts, avoided conversation, and lived in the background of towns that forgot her as soon as she left. She aged slowly, almost not at all. People assumed she was younger than she was, and she never corrected them. There was no one to correct. There was no one who remembered where she came from. Her records followed her like a shadow. Redacted pages, missing signatures, sealed case numbers. Even those assigned to manage her file avoided reading too far back. Something about that history felt like a place the mind shouldn't look directly into. She never spoke about the others, never asked about them, never hinted that she had once been connected to 16 voices inside a single consciousness. But sometimes in group homes, residents complained that she hummed in her sleep, a low tone that made the walls vibrate. Staff dismissed it. They dismissed everything about her. It was easier than wondering. For almost 40 years, she went unnoticed. Until a journalist, searching for something else entirely, stumbled across a reference that shouldn't have existed. His research into abandoned Appalachian communities led him into archives, and those archives led him into sealed legal documents. Most of the pages were blacked out, but one line remained. Subject 11 remains alive. That was enough to become obsession. He tracked down witnesses who refused to speak. He requested records that arrived with more redactions than text. He found doctors who changed the subject, nurses who moved across the country, and a psychiatrist who had vanished from public life decades earlier. Every lead pointed to something the state wanted forgotten. Eventually, through a bureaucratic oversight, he found her name, or rather, the name she had been given long after the state had erased her origins. He wrote letters. She ignored them. He persisted. For 6 months he tried, until finally she agreed to meet. They sat in a diner on a cold November afternoon. She arrived without a coat, yet didn't appear cold. She spoke softly, but her voice carried in a way that made the air feel heavier. The journalist recorded the conversation. That recording was never released. But fragments were transcribed. When he asked her about the other children, she didn't speak at first. She looked out the window, watching cars pass, and then said something that the journalist later described as the most unsettling thing he'd ever heard, because she said it like a memory, not a metaphor. They weren't children. He asked what she meant. She said they were continuations, not born, not created in any way the human mind understands. Continued. As if the lineage was a single consciousness, moving forward through bodies that weren't individuals, just vessels. A hive mind wearing human shapes, a memory passed down without birth, without death, without choice. She described a ritual, though she refused to detail it. She said it involved soil, blood, and something she called the speaking, a kind of summoning, not of a spirit, but of a continuation of something already living. New bodies appeared when they were needed, fully formed, already woven into the collective mind. They did not grow into themselves. They arrived complete. That was why separation killed them. Not emotionally, biologically. A severed piece of a single organism cannot live on its own. The journalist asked what happened when the collective began to fracture in the facility, when identities formed, when names became possible, when individuality appeared. She said that individuality was decay, that the lineage had begun to die long before the state found them. The rituals had stopped, the continuity had weakened, the consciousness had begun to splinter. She said she was the last, but she said it without pride or sorrow, just inevitability. She lived with the remnants of the others still inside her mind, not as voices, but as pressure, like a crowded room after everyone has left. She said she tried to become human, to exist as one instead of many, but the mind she carried was not designed for singularity. Humanity was too small for what she was. And then she said something the journalist never published in full. She said the Dalhart lineage wasn't born in the mountains. It fled there, from somewhere older, somewhere it refused to name. When the journalist asked what the lineage really was, she didn't answer directly. She looked at him, eyes unblinking, and said, "You think we were pretending to be human, but we weren't pretending. We were remembering." Then she added, "And we are forgetting." The interview ended shortly after. She stood, thanked him, and left without looking back. 2 years later, she died. 3 days before anyone noticed. No decay, no rigidity, no weight, until suddenly, too much weight for 4 people to lift. Then none at all. The journalist attended her burial. He wrote that when the first soil hit the coffin, he felt something loosen in the world. Not vanish, just release, like a rope finally untied after centuries of tension. He never wrote the book. He abandoned his research. He moved across the country. When asked why, he said only, "Some stories don't want to be told." But the story didn't end with her, because a lineage that was never born does not end with a body. A lineage like that waits, not alive, not dead, just paused. And in the years after her burial, there were signs. Symbols found carved into abandoned wood. Humming heard in forests where no houses stood. Circles of dead earth where the soil refused to grow. Children seen at dawn, standing perfectly still in the trees. 17 of them. Always 17. Watching, silent. Waiting. After her burial, it should have been over. The state assumed the story was finished. The last living link was gone. The records remained sealed. The witnesses remained silent. And the world continued, unaware that something older than families and older than memory had finally reached its end. Except endings leave a mark. 3 months after her death, a surveyor working government land near the old Hollow Ridge territory reported finding remnants of the Dalhart property. The barn was gone, collapsed decades earlier, but the main house still stood, barely upright, leaning like something exhausted. He stepped inside with a flashlight and saw that every wall was carved with symbols, not painted, not written, carved, hundreds of them covering every surface, from floor to ceiling, even on the underside of beams no human could easily reach. He photographed them. The images were sent to a linguist who said they weren't random. They followed grammatical structure. They conveyed instruction, not decoration, not art, a process, a ritual, a language unspoken for generations but remembered by wood. 2 weeks later, the surveyor returned to document the house more thoroughly. The house was gone. Not decayed, not burned. Gone. The foundation remained. The soil was undisturbed. No debris, no collapse pattern, no remnants of timber or nails or stone. Just absence. Clean, surgical, final, as if the house had never existed at all. The report was filed, then quietly ignored. But the observations continued. Hikers in the region described hearing humming at night. The same tone that had once made grown men clutch their skulls. Hunters found rings of dead earth, perfect circles where vegetation should have thrived. The soil within them was gray and silent, as though life refused to take root there. No insects, no moisture, just stillness. Some sightings were harder to dismiss. A family camping near the ridge awoke at dawn and saw figures in the tree line. Children, 17 of them, standing perfectly still, watching the tent. Not speaking, not blinking. When sunlight reached the trees, the figures were gone. Authorities insisted there were no children living in the area. The family left that morning and never returned. Reports spread quietly, on forums, in message boards, whispered in bars where people pretended not to believe the words they were saying. No one spoke to officials. No one wanted the story to become real. Then, in 2023, a woman in Kentucky claimed she was descended from the Dalhart line. She said her grandmother had escaped the ridge in the 1930s, before the barn, before the state intervention, before the silence. On her deathbed, the grandmother confessed something. The Dalharts were not a family. They were a continuation, something older than blood, older than names, older than humanity wearing a human mask for so long that the mask began to resemble a face. And she said something else. A lineage doesn't die when the body does. A lineage returns when the pattern is remembered. The woman who came forward said she dreamed of symbols carved into wood. She dreamed of humming beneath the earth. She woke with dirt under her fingernails, though her home had no soil floors. She said she felt something moving beneath her skin, not alive, not dead, not separate. Waiting. People dismissed her, but she wasn't the only one. Others, scattered across Appalachia, across rural towns, across families who kept quiet histories, reported similar dreams, similar symbols, similar humming, as though something buried had begun to breathe again, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to change the air. Because the Dalhart lineage was never a bloodline. It was a pattern, and patterns do not die. Patterns repeat. They resurface when conditions return, when the soil remembers, when the mind becomes quiet enough to hear what was always beneath it. The state tried to bury the truth. The witnesses tried to forget. The last continuation tried to become human. But the land never forgot, and the land is where the lineage began, not in wombs, not in birth, but in continuation. If the symbols are returning, if the humming is returning, if the sightings are returning, then the lineage is not gone. It is reforming, not born, not created, recalled. The question is not whether the Dalhart continuation has awakened again. The question is, how many bodies does it need before it becomes whole? And how many of those bodies are already here? There is a rule in human history. Anything we bury eventually comes back. Not because it survives, but because we remember it. Memory is the true preservation. Memory is the true continuation. And the Dalhart lineage was never a matter of blood, or flesh, or ancestry. It was a pattern held in the human mind, passed quietly, silently, without intention. It spread through stories told in whispers, through warnings, through dreams, through the simple act of wondering. That is why the state tried to erase it, not to protect the public, but to starve the memory. Because once a mind becomes aware of the pattern has a place to live. After the last continuation died, there should have been silence. But silence was never the goal. Silence was the waiting place. Reports began subtly. People living hundreds of miles apart described the same sensation of pressure behind the eyes, a hum beneath the floorboards, a feeling of standing in a room that used to have someone else in it. None of them knew the story. None of them had heard the name. But the pattern does not require knowledge, only attention. Objects began moving again. Chairs turned inward, mirrors angled away from their reflections, doors that refused to stay open. Children were seen standing in circles in schoolyards, not speaking, not playing, just watching. Doctors dismissed it. Parents rationalized it. Schools avoided paperwork. One teacher said the children moved their heads at the exact same time, as though listening to something no one else could hear. Another said the classroom felt crowded, even when half the students were absent. A third quit mid-year, leaving a single sentence on her resignation form: "They breathe together." The symbols appeared next, not carved this time, but drawn in notebooks, in dust on windows, in condensation on glass after showers. Children claimed they didn't remember drawing them. Adults claimed they didn't notice them. But the shapes were always the same loops and angles that weren't letters, weren't numbers, but felt like instructions. A linguist analyzing one photograph said the symbols were waiting for completion. She stopped answering emails a week later. And then there were the dreams. People who had never met, never spoken, never shared a life, reported the same images. A barn door opening. 17 faces in the dark. Eyes that did not blink. A voice that was not a voice, saying, "We are remembering." Some woke with soil beneath their nails. Some woke standing up. Some woke humming. The question experts refused to ask was simple. If the continuation did not require blood, if it did not require birth, if it only required awareness, then where is it now? Because a lineage that can inhabit multiple bodies at once does not need children in a barn. It does not need isolation. It does not need a physical place at all. It only needs observers, witnesses, people who hear the story and feel something shift inside their mind, like a door opening in a house they didn't know they lived in. The final survivor said, "We were not pretending to be human. We were remembering." But she also said, "We are forgetting." And there lies the truth the state feared. The continuation does not die when the last body falls. It dies when the last memory fades. So long as someone remembers the story, even a fragment, even a whisper, even a feeling, the lineage remains. Quiet, formless, distributed, reassembling itself thought by thought, mind by mind, breath by breath, until one day the pattern becomes whole again, not born, not created, continued. And here is the part no report ever wrote, no journalist ever printed, no witness ever said aloud, The moment you hear the story, you become part of the pattern. The memory has a place to live. The continuation has a place to root. And the lineage has one question left to answer, not where it will return, but how many of you it needs before it stands up again. If you feel pressure behind your eyes now, if the room seems quieter than it should be, if you become aware of your own breathing, that is not fear. That is recognition, because the Dalhart lineage was never trapped in bodies. It was trapped in silence, and now you have broken it. The humming you think you hear isn't coming from the room. It's coming from the part of you that has already begun to remember.